Thank you, Chair Doherty, members of the committee. I'm Representative Lew Frederick, House District 43, that's North and Northeast Portland. I'm here to introduce the issues associated with this group of bills, and especially to suggest the questions that should be asked, not just about the bills, but about the educational dynamic that inspired them. 2 years ago, I was before this committee with House Bill 2664, similar to this year's House Bill 2713. My request was and remains pretty straightforward. I want to see an honest evaluation of the costs and benefits of these changes. What is the impact of mandatory high-stakes testing on education programs and educational environments in Oregon? What is better for it and what is worse? The educational environment in Oregon's public schools has changed, and the imposition of mandatory high-stakes tests is a driver. I simply asked, and I'm asking again, for a comprehensive review of these effects. We have all heard stories. They're often dismissed as anecdotal. To undergo such a radical change without an honest evaluation of whether it makes anything better is, to me, unconscionable. The Oregon Department of Education has submitted testimony that pertaining to the fiscal, administrative, and educational impacts of tests on schools will require significant research and time for both the department and school districts. It's really pretty amazing to me that we would make radical changes to the school environment without that information. But that is what has happened. You will hear testimony from parents and teachers about what the effects have been already, and their anticipation that these effects will intensify as implementation progresses. We have heard why the tests are mandatory. It's because they are mandated by the NCLB waiver, by state adoptions, whatever. To call this a circular reasoning is actually a bit generous. What is not answered is this regimen an educational best practice? If we can't talk about the effects on teaching and learning, then we can't make good decisions about policies. And the second question has to be, are the tests being implemented assessment best practices? 2 years ago, I warned about heading down this road without these answers, and here we are, with both the tests and the high stakes attached to them upon us. And that is why this time I've also introduced two other bills, 2714, to somewhat loosen the mandatory aspect by clarifying and expanding the option to forego testing and about information available to families, and 2715 to protect students from potential public disclosure of their scores on these tests. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the assumptions that underlie this push to subject our children to unrelenting testing. The assumption that children are empty vessels and that education is the process of filling them. If children were seen as growing, developing minds, growing in response to stimulating opportunities, I believe we would design our whole approach differently. The assumption that the business-generated model of reverse engineering or backtracking accurately tells us what a young person should know in order to prepare them for the world about 20 years from now. The assumption that a test score is an outcome or a valid marker of outcomes. The assumption that shortcomings in educational achievement result from lack of measurement or from failures of students or teachers to work hard enough. The assumption that achievement gaps can be addressed without acknowledging underlying causative factors. Now, in the past 2 years, this issue has become more urgent. The new tests mandated for this year are projected to result in failure rates as high as 70%. That is one of the factors that leads me to ask, does this represent professional best practices for assessment? I'm going to back up a little bit and take a minute to talk about the achievement gaps. When somebody claims that a program will promote equity or be especially for students of color or underserved populations or at-risk students, I am, to say the least, skeptical. For decades, we have seen prescriptions for children of poverty that involve regimented back-to-basics approaches. Then we wring our hands about why they don't respond all that well. Meanwhile, families of means take advantage of the choices they have to ensure that their kids are stimulated to engage in the world as their minds develop. Parents with means do not typically drill their students on the skills needed to pass standardized tests. No, they are the ones at schools and school boards protesting the time spent on them. They don't sign their kids up for back to basics or 3 R's programs. They sign their kids up for enrichment activities. In fact, here are some characteristics of the education of kids of well-off families. The learning day doesn't end when the school day ends. They might play sports or be involved in other activities that challenge them. Their parents sign them up for activities that address not deficiencies in the kids, but deficiencies in the school program. They go to art classes and science classes, or parents design home activities of their own. Parents who have the means spare no expense to make sure their kids have a chance to do interesting things. And the learning year doesn't end when the school year ends. They go to camps and classes and swim lessons. They go home to a warm home and dinner, and even if mom is rushed. Oops, I'm too close. Sorry about that. Even if mom is rushed, I'm sure we could probably extend this list. So when somebody says that they have a program that will help poor children and children of color, I'm going to ask, how does it enrich the hours after school? How does it make sure that they have interesting things to learn and experience every day that make them want to learn more? How does it enrich their summer and their other school vacation times? How does it ensure that they are secure in shelter and food and support? Motivation is notoriously hard to measure, but it's a vital part of the educational process. If we kill motivation, our successes in the measurable world are not likely to matter. Growing minds are living and growing and interacting with the world, and the world they will understand differently from how we understand it, and a world they will shape. Our, and by our I mean their future, depends on not only acquiring knowledge but also growing up. It depends on their having the persistence, the resilience, the curiosity, the maturity, and the moral compass needed to solve problems, as well as knowledge, skills, and abilities. Their survival may depend on solving problems we will never see and can't even imagine. Furthermore, I believe that if we care about their future and happiness and fulfillment, we must care about the quality of the experiences they have now. Ultimately, that's a large part of my concern. It is the focus on outputs, however well or poorly they are defined, simply a diversion that takes our eyes off the inputs. Now, if you're growing tomatoes, you want a good outcome, but it's not magic. It doesn't happen because you keep measuring the plants. In fact, you can have indications that your outcomes are going to be good all along the way, and then find out at the end of the summer that you've grown huge plants with no tomatoes. That's because your inputs weren't the right ones for producing fruit. Tomatoes need light, warmth, fertilizer, and water for good outcomes. And growing children need stimulation, wonder, and excitement, as well as educational content for good outcomes. If we don't focus on high-quality inputs, we're going to be disappointed in our outcomes, no matter what those test scores look like. If the outcome we seek is an innovative and resilient economy and a vibrant and functioning civic and cultural life, then what do the test scores we are pushing for now have to do with it? What do the inputs we are settling for now have to do with it? Those are frankly my questions. So here's what the three bills do. HB 2713 asks for answers to my questions. What are the costs and benefits of state-mandated high-stakes tests, standardized tests? We are often encouraged to embrace change, but change is not always good. Sometimes it's just turmoil. These changes to our public education system affect an entire generation and inflict significant turmoil. How can we continue without knowing whether they provide sufficient benefit to teaching and learning to make that turmoil worth it? We have gone far down the trail of committing resources of time and money to this testing regimen, and as it turns out, far down the trail of allowing it to drive what our students study and how they study it. It is past time to get some hard evidence as to whether we're on the right trail. Because if we're not, every school year is another year going in the wrong direction. This bill simply recognizes that educational policy should be evaluated as to outcomes. It calls for an evaluation of the effects of standardized testing as currently mandated, cost-to-benefit analysis, if you will. Here in this building, we are pretty fixated on one budget, the one where we decide where to spend our limited dollars. But in a public school classroom, there are several resources that are also on a tight budget. Time, the teacher's attention, the student's attention, everybody's enthusiasm, to name some. When we're thinking about costs versus benefits, those budgets have to be taken into account. Questions about the credibility of the coming consortium tests and their uses give rise to two other bills I propose. HB 2714 clarifies parents' rights to opt out of these tests. Currently, parents may request exemption on religious grounds. Most of the objections I hear are based on ethical and intellectual reasons, and this bill allows parents to base their decisions on these concerns. The majority of the objections I hear from constituents and professionals are based on the quality of the tests themselves, the validity of their application, and the effects on curriculum and the learning environment. This bill also provides that that alternative means of demonstrating proficiency can be used to qualify for a diploma. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not promoting the idea that a parent should be able to neglect a child's education. I've received communications about exempting homeschooled kids in which the term unschooled is used. That gives me a great pause. I believe that failure to educate a child is neglect bordering on abuse, and anyone who exempts their child from a system that involves licensed teachers and other safeguards has to provide some evidence that the child is in fact being educated. Again, the majority of the objections I hear have to do with the educational effects of these tests on public school students. Finally, HB 2715 is intended to address the use of so-called data walls. These are instances in which schools have displayed students' scores, often in response to a mandate from district administrators. By their nature, such display is available to individuals who have no proper use of the identifiable information and extends the culture of shame and punishment that characterizes much of the push to use test scores for punitive rather than educational purposes. A number of parents and professionals are here to expand on what I've said. One of the most important things we do as decision makers is to look for the rest of the story. The stories from the classroom and the homework desk are immensely important to this debate. When those who are intimately involved in the process raise alarm about what is happening to motivation and educational stimulation, essential inputs, we should pay attention. And finally, because it's me, I want to share a summary of a satire I ran across, which I think I'll be happy to provide as a reprint if you'd like it. It's called All Babies Walking by 6 Months Old. It starts, a group of professional sports teams owners and product sponsors decided that the United States was losing ground globally in producing high-quality athletes. So they met with the president and the national secretary of the Department of Sports to convince them to set new athletic policies. Soon after, the RTTS, Race to the Stadium, was established. A committee was selected to write a new and rigorous standard starting from womb to stadium. The new early babyhood common sports state standards were established. Number 1, all children shall walk by 6 months old. All children shall run by 6.5 months old. All children shall do somersaults by 7 months old. All children shall do cartwheels by 7.5 months old. It was ensured by adhering to these rigorous standards, all babies would be on track for the Olympics and/or professional athleticism. The piece is lengthy and detailed and meticulously paralleling the development of the Common Core state standards and the measurements used to evaluate and enforce progress on them. I wish I could say that it was just plain ridiculous. Unfortunately, it's not that far of a reach.
Okay,
thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you very much.